We have something surprising in common with many of the Jews who lived during the centuries around the turn of the era, including at least a number of the authors of what would become our New Testament. We engage our scriptures in a translation rather than in their original language. For most Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Greek and Roman periods, this means that they read their Old Testament scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, in Greek rather than in Hebrew or in Aramaic. The most common name that you'll find for this Old Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is the Septuagint, a name that came into vogue in Christian circles in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, based on a legend about 70 or 72 Jewish sages being involved in the initial translation of the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, called the Pentateuch in Greek, a word meaning 5 scrolls. Septuagint is simply a loan word from the Latin meaning 70. In this brief introduction, I seek to provide some foundational awareness about the Septuagint, its importance as a witness to how the Old Testament was heard and understood in the centuries around the turn of the era, and some traces of its use by the authors of the New Testament. The demand for a Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures ultimately arose as a consequence of the military activity of Alexander the Great. The eastward campaigns of his army through Anatolia and Syria and southward through Palestine into Egypt between 334 and 332 BC brought these former territories into his new empire. He would shortly thereafter absorb the remainder of the Persian Empire. In a very short compass, therefore, the language of an international empire shifted from Aramaic, the international language of the Persian Empire, to Greek. Alexander died prematurely in 323 BC, and in the internal wars that followed, his empire was carved up among his generals, all of whom nevertheless maintained Greek as the language of the administration of their kingdoms. The territory of Palestine was held as part of the Ptolemaic Empire, the Greek empire based in Egypt, until the end of the 3rd century BC. Large segments of the elite and the skilled sectors of local populations throughout these territories made it a priority to acquire Greek so as to continue to enjoy what roles and status under the Macedonian kings that they previously enjoyed under Persian rule. There had been large Jewish populations outside of Palestine since before the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah in 596 BC. These diaspora communities continued to grow during the centuries that followed, whether as a result of individual families seeking advantages, rulers moving blocks of populations about for their own strategic purposes, or further episodes of deportation. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, this increasingly became the Greek-speaking diaspora during the 3rd century BC. Alexandria in Egypt was home to the largest such community, even though there were also large Jewish communities in Antioch on the Orontes and other cities in the Seleucid Empire, as well as in other cities and towns in the Ptolemaic Empire. The precise reasons for the first translations of the Jewish scriptures, especially the 5 books of Moses, are debated. What is not debated, however, is that the Greek-speaking Jewish communities in Egypt and more broadly throughout the Eastern Mediterranean came to engage their sacred texts increasingly in Greek translation. Translations of the books of our Old Testament emerged from different hands over the space of at least a century. The translators varied in their approach. Some books follow the Hebrew very closely, like the books of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and the Psalms. Others show a greater desire for a more fluid and idiomatic Greek translation, like Job and Proverbs. There is also considerable variation among the historical and prophetic books, with the translators of Isaiah, for example, showing a greater interest in an idiomatic Greek translation, while the translators of Jeremiah and Ezekiel provide a more formal equivalent rendering, a rendering in which the syntax and vocabulary of the Hebrew is more readily apparent in the Greek translation. We have an early and important testimony concerning the Greek translations of the Jewish scriptures from the grandson of the scribe and sage known as Ben Sira. Ben Sira was himself a scribe and the head of a school in Jerusalem that flourished around 200 to 180 BC. Ben Sira's grandson undertook a translation of his grandfather's collection of wisdom instructions from Hebrew into Greek, and in his prologue he addresses the reader directly concerning the fruit of his labors as a translator. You are invited, therefore, to read it with good will and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly, despite our diligent labor in translating. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same effect when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. In the 38th year of the reign of Ptolemy Euergetes, when I came to Egypt and stayed for some time, I found a copy affording no little instruction. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labor to the translation of this book. During that time, I have applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are preparing to live according to the law. One important thing that Ben Sira's grandson tells us is that by or around the year 132 BC, the 38th year of the reign of this particular Ptolemy, the law, the writings of the prophets, and some number of the remaining books, the category we would tend to equate with the writings or the poetical and wisdom books like Psalms and Proverbs, were available to be read in Greek, and that familiarity with them could be assumed among Jews in Egypt as well as among the Jews in the grandson's native community. A second important thing that Ben Sira's grandson tells us is that there were evident differences between the texts of these scriptures as known from Hebrew manuscripts and the Greek translations. As he put it, the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. Some of the differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text can be attributed to the translators of the Jewish scriptures using Hebrew texts that differ from the standardized Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament on which most modern English translations are based. A comparison of the Masoretic text of Jeremiah 10, verses 1 through 10, with the Septuagint version of the same shows that the Septuagint contains significantly less material. Specifically, while it contains the material critical of the gods or idols of the nations, it omits the verses that interject praise of the God of Israel. So if we were to look side by side, we would see only the most minor differences between the Masoretic text of Jeremiah 10, 1 through 4, and the Septuagint text of the same. But when we move forward, we begin to see some differences. The Septuagint, we'll say, interjects what would be for us, reading our English Old Testaments, chapter 10, verse 9, into the middle of what would be for us, chapter 10, verse 5. And then when we get to our chapter 10, verse 6 in our English translations of Jeremiah following the Masoretic text, there begins a section that has no parallel in the Septuagint. Similarly, verses 7 and 8 have no parallel material in the Septuagint translation. 10:9 appears where we typically number it, But of course in the Septuagint that material came earlier in the paragraph. And then what we find in Jeremiah 10 verse 10 has no parallel in the Septuagint. Thus, all those verses that praise the God of Israel as so different from the gods of the nations by virtue of being a living God don't appear in the Septuagint version at all. What could possibly account for this? Scholars typically defer to the Masoretic text as the definitive text of the Old Testament, but this is not always the case, especially since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves surrounding the Essene community at Qumran. These now give access to physical copies of books or parts of books of the Old Testament that are a full 1,000 years older than our oldest manuscripts for the Masoretic text. And one of the Hebrew texts of Jeremiah, one of the Hebrew manuscripts of Jeremiah found at Qumran, preserves enough of Jeremiah chapter 10 to allow us to see that it also contained only the material found in the Septuagint and in the same order of material. Thus, our earliest Hebrew manuscript of Jeremiah corroborates the reading of Septuagint Jeremiah and suggests that, at the very least, Jeremiah circulated in a shorter form in both Hebrew and Greek prior to the turn of the era. Overall, the Septuagint version of Jeremiah is about 1/8 shorter than the Hebrew version known from our Old Testaments. It is likely in this particular case that the Septuagint contains the more original form of Jeremiah 10, while the Masoretic text preserves a different and quite probably later form of the text, where a tirade against idols was expanded to include verses in praise of the one true God. One can observe similar phenomena in regard to several other books composed in Hebrew and translated into Greek. The Greek version of Job is about 1/6 shorter than the Hebrew of the Masoretic text, and the omissions increase proportionately the further one reads into the book. In that case, it's more likely that the translator engaged in judicious abridging, given the admittedly repetitive nature of Job, not to mention the uncommon difficulty of its Hebrew. Probably more likely that than that the translator, the Greek translator, had a variant Hebrew text such as one finds underlying the Septuagint text of Jeremiah. The Greek version of Esther, by contrast, is longer than the Hebrew by virtue of 6 additional blocks of material and alterations and short additions throughout the whole text, by means of which Esther becomes a much more religious book in which God is present and appealed to throughout, and the distinctive practices and boundary markers of Jews are introduced. In that case, it seems that the longer version is an intentional expansion of an older version of Esther, which was regarded as somewhat problematic for the absence of, God from the narrative, as well as the typical practices that one would expect Jews in a diaspora setting to safeguard. The book of Daniel fares similarly, sporting 2 additional tales and 2 lengthy liturgical interpolations. A number of differences between the Old Testament that we know from the English translations of the Masoretic texts and the Septuagint version can be attributed to different ways that a translator could legitimately interpret the Hebrew text, which in its pre-Masoretic form included only limited indications of vowels. A great deal of the work of the Jewish scholars known as the Masoretes of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD involved the meticulous addition of vowels, for which a system of dots and lines had been developed. One example of this occurs in Genesis chapter 47, verse 31, where one finds Jacob worshiping either at the head of his bed or at the head, that is the top, of his staff. The Hebrew consonantal text simply read the Hebrew characters for M, T, and H, which could be understood once one added what one thought were the appropriate vowels as mateh, staff, or mitah, bed. The Masoretic scribes added vowels that ensured the reading bed, but the translators of the Septuagint had evidently read the word as staff. It's impossible to say that the Masoretes' decision was superior to that of the Septuagint translators in this regard. The author of the Hebrews, notably, follows the Septuagint's exegesis in Hebrews 11, verse 21, as do the translators of the NIV. Other differences are the result of the new social and cultural location in which the Greek translators and their audiences found themselves, coupled with the translators' desire to make meaningful and culturally sensitive translational decisions for a 3rd or 2nd century BC diaspora Jewish audience. For example, the translators of Psalms and Isaiah make rather consistent choices when rendering a Hebrew expression that calls God a rock. A rock was a wonderful image to express God's reliability, or the strength God gives the worshiper, or the way God gives the worshiper something hard and real to hold on to. But when one moves from Israel to Alexandria in Roman Egypt, or Antioch in Roman Syria, one finds oneself surrounded by rocks, carved stone images of many gods whom their worshippers also pronounce blessed, and from whom these worshippers seek safety, protection, and the like. Expressions like "Blessed be my rock" in the Psalms are rendered differently so as to avoid making any connection with the worship of rocks and stones happening everywhere around the Jewish community. Here, for example, in Psalm 62, which happens to be numbered as Psalm 61 in the Septuagint, because in the Septuagint version, our Psalms 9 and 10 become Psalm 9, one psalm, and that just knocks the numbering of the rest of the psalms off until you get to something like Psalm 146 or so. In any event, based on the Hebrew text, the NRSV would read, He, namely God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken. The Septuagint translator eliminates the metaphor because he is my God and my Savior, my protector, I shall never be put to flight. And then again in the following verse, my mighty rock becomes the God of my help. Similarly, in Psalm 18 and Psalm 144, the Hebrew rock is simply rendered God, despite the redundancies that result, especially in Psalm 18. The translator's consistency in this regard suggests intentionality, likely to honor the distinction between the God of Israel and the gods of stone and other materials worshipped by the non-Jewish majorities around them. Another interesting example that may show the translator's interest in important markers of Jewish identity and practice shows up in the translation of Genesis 2. Here it concerns the very important and very visible practice of Sabbath observance. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of Genesis 2 verse 2 reads, On the 7th day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. The Septuagint, but also the Samaritan version of the Pentateuch, as well as the Syriac translation, reads instead, On the 6th day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. It is possible, I would suggest likely, that the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Samaritan versions all follow an alternative Hebrew textual tradition that read 6th rather than 7th, though such variant Hebrew manuscripts are lacking. The copies of the scrolls of Genesis among the Dead Sea Scrolls are too fragmentary at Genesis 2 to tell. Another explanation, however, is that several different Jewish communities recognized the problem in the Hebrew text and corrected it, so that there was no hint that God might have been working on any part of the seventh day. The NRSV chooses to follow these traditions rather than the Masoretic text, while the NIV fudges this a bit by reading, "By the seventh day, God had finished the work," etc. In sum, we do not always know how to account for the differences we can observe between the Masoretic text of the Hebrew, and thus the majority of English Old Testaments, and the Septuagint. The Greek translator might have been working from a Hebrew text different from the text that would emerge as the Masoretic text, such as are amply in evidence among the biblical scrolls found in the caves around Qumran. The Greek translator might have interpreted the text differently during the pre-Masoretic period, in which vowels were not supplied beyond the 3 consonants that marked the presence of some kind of a particular class of vowels. I'm referring to the aleph, the he, and the vav. I guess I should say 4, because there's also the yod, which indicate a vowel of some class, but don't begin to attest to every vowel that has to be assumed in order to even pronounce the cluster of consonants. The Greek translator might have made an error in negotiating the Hebrew text, unconsciously misreading one or more letters. Or the Greek translator might have made an intentional alteration for the sake of clearer communication of an idea in a changed social and cultural context. We return at this point to the second observation made by Ben Sira's grandson in regard to the translation of the Jewish scriptures. What was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same effect when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. Such an unavoidable observation produced 2 opposite reactions. One response was to assert the reliability, even the inspiration, of the Greek translation that was in broad use by the late 2nd century BC, and even more broadly by the turn of the era, assuring its users of its legitimacy as authoritative scripture. Legends developed about the translation and about the translators themselves. The letter of Aristeas, written in the second half of the 2nd century BC, attributes the translation of the 5 books of Moses to royal initiative on the part of Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt and his librarian, Demetrius of Phalerum. The king sends an embassy to the high priest in Jerusalem, who dispatches 72 learned, bilingual Jewish scholars to undertake the translation. The text stresses the credentials and wisdom of the Jerusalem-trained scribes behind the translation. By the 1st century AD, we find even more extravagant legends. According to Philo of Alexandria, each of the 70 translators worked independently, and when their results were compared, they were all found to have produced exactly the same translation. Philo acclaimed this as a miracle of divine, prophetic inspiration. This only makes sense, of course, since now you can hardly get 2 scholars to agree on a translation, let alone 70. Philo praised the translators as, quote, "not mere interpreters, but inspired speakers and prophets to whose honest and guileless minds was given the leadership of the most pure spirit of Moses." Thus, the Septuagint was defended as an inspired translation that matched the inspired original in authority and legitimacy. The other response was to undertake revisions of the Greek translations, often with a view to bringing them into closer conformity to the Hebrew text that was emerging as the authoritative text in the early rabbinic period, after the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple in the year 70. Several such revisions were undertaken in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, each of which attempts a more formal equivalent translation, and thus to represent the Hebrew text as it was then known, especially in Palestine, more transparently in the Greek. One of the most pressing reasons for students of the New Testament to become acquainted with the Septuagint is the fact that at many points the authors of the New Testament draw upon material from the Old Testament in Greek. This is particularly important to consider when the quotation of an Old Testament passage in the New Testament differs from the text of the Old Testament known from Hebrew text traditions. And the influence of the Greek translations of the Old Testament is everywhere apparent in the New. I will focus here only on a few examples from the Acts of the Apostles and the letter to the Hebrews. We find a striking variation between the Hebrew and the Greek versions of Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, in the Acts of the Apostles. In most English Bibles, we would read something like the following text if we looked this passage up in the book of Amos. On that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, in order that they may possess the remnants of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name. In the Greek versions, we would read this instead, and here I've adapted the NRSV to the Septuagint text to make the precise differences more apparent. On that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and repair its fallen parts, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as the days of the age, in order that the rest of humankind and all the nations over whom my name is invoked may seek it out. The two text traditions affirm significantly different purposes for the restoration of Israel. In the Hebrew text, God was to restore Israel in order to position her for domination over her immediate neighbors, the Edomites and the other people groups that had encroached upon the land that Israel viewed as its divine inheritance. In the Greek text, God was to restore Israel in order to draw all humankind to it, probably in keeping with the hope of Isaiah and the Psalms that all nations would come to seek and worship the one God as a result of Israel's restoration. The difference may have resulted from the Greek translator's honest attempts to understand the Hebrew text before him, which consisted chiefly of consonants with minimum indications of what vowels were to be supplied. The Hebrew for Edom could have been read as Adam, that is, humankind. The verbs for they will possess and they will seek differ by only one consonant, which could easily have been mistaken. But the new reading found in the Greek text becomes relevant for readers of the New Testament because of the important, even decisive role that the quotation from Amos plays in what is arguably the turning point in Acts. Acts chapter 15 relates the episode of the Jerusalem Council at which James, Peter, Paul, Barnabas, and the rest of the church leaders decided, in the face of a contrary proposal brought by some Jewish Christians, that Gentiles could join the church on the basis of trusting Jesus, being baptized, and receiving the Holy Spirit, without the requirement to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. When James pronounces this verdict, he cites Amos 9, verses 11 and 12 in the Greek tradition as the scriptural basis and authority for this decision. The Hebrew text, which speaks of the restoration of the house of David for the purpose of political conquest, would not lend itself to such a reading as we find in Acts. The Greek version helps legitimate the direction that the early church took as it moved from a Jewish Christian movement, in which the booth of David is restored through the gathering together of Christ followers from Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, the regions comparable to the dimensions of the historic Davidic kingdom, to a movement that is drawing Gentiles in large numbers, the rest of the nations, seeking out God by means of the Jesus movement, the restored tent of David. And that will do so more and more as the narrative of Acts continues to unfold with Paul's missionary journeys to Macedonia, Greece, and Roman Asia. When we turn to the letter to the Hebrews, we find another author whose recitations of the Old Testament align closely with the Septuagint, and who exploits the significance of those texts at precisely the points at which they diverge from the Hebrew text tradition. In the midst of a string of recitations from passages from the Psalms and several other Old Testament books, the author quotes Psalm 104, verse 4. He does so, however, in a manner that very clearly follows the Septuagint against the Hebrew text, as known both from the Masoretic text and the much older Psalms scroll found in a cave near Qumran. In the Hebrew, God makes the winds his messengers, fire and flame his ministers. But in the Greek, God makes his messengers winds, and his ministers flaming fire. In the Hebrew text of the psalm, the emphasis falls on God's command over natural elements and forces to make them do his bidding. In the Greek translation, the emphasis falls rather on the transformation of God's messengers and agents into winds and fire. The author of Hebrews appeals to this text specifically to stress the mutability of angels and other spirit beings in God's service, in contrast to the immutability of the divine Son. It thus provides another proof in a series of proofs of the Son's superiority to the angels, and therefore the superiority and greater gravity of the message that the Son brought, namely the summons to obey the gospel, in comparison with the message that the angels brought, namely the covenant at Mount Sinai. A short while later, the author of Hebrews will quote extensively from Psalm 8 and apply the content of the verses quoted, Psalm 8 verses 4 and 5, to the career of Jesus. In the process, he exploits an ambiguity in the Greek translation that was not present in the original Hebrew text. In the Hebrew, the psalm reads, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the divine beings, and crowned him with glory and honor." The psalm celebrates the exalted place of human beings on the ladder of creation, as it were, just a rung below deity or spirit beings. When the psalm was translated into Greek, however, the phrase chosen to represent a little lower could refer to either distance or time, a little bit lower, or a little while lower. Taking the text in the latter sense, it becomes an elegant testimony to the career of one particular Son of Man, Jesus, who was in fact made lower than the angels for a little while in his incarnation, and was subsequently crowned with glory and honor in his exaltation to God's right hand. Another example appears later in the sermon to the Hebrews, near the climax of the author's exploration of how Jesus has offered the supremely effective sacrifice that cleanses human beings from sin and consecrates them to enter into the very presence of God in heaven itself. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 to 7, the author quotes Psalm 40, verses 6 to 8, or in the Septuagint, Psalm 39, verses 7 to 9. Reading this text In line with the Masoretic text, as in most of our English Old Testaments, we would read, "Sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but you have dug out ears for me. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, Here I am. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart." When we turn to the Septuagint, we would read, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. You did not ask for whole burnt offerings or sin offerings. Then I said, Behold, I am here. In the scroll of the book it is written about me, I desired to do your will, O my God, and your law is in the midst of my heart." It is more in line with the latter that we encounter the psalm as quoted in Hebrews 10. "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, See, I have come, in the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God." The critical difference between the Hebrew and Greek texts of the psalm is the Greek translator's abandonment of the homely image of God digging out our ears, reminiscent perhaps of God forming Adam by molding the natural clay of the ground so that we could hear the law so as to do it, replacing this with the image of God preparing for the psalmist a body. The Septuagint translator no doubt intended for his readers to discern the same meaning as in the original Hebrew. God wants his people to live out the Torah, to be responsive and obedient in the first place, and values this far more than sacrifice. The shift in language, however, created for the author of Hebrews the possibility of a very different reading when he applied the psalm to Jesus. God prepared for Jesus a body that could be offered up as a sacrifice that would be superior to those burnt offerings and sacrifices that the psalmist says God rejected, and therefore could be effective in a way that those sacrifices never had been. Psalm 40 becomes, in the hands of the author of Hebrews, an Old Testament warrant for one particular human sacrifice, quite different from any sacrifice prescribed by the law of Moses. We can also see something of the freedom with which the New Testament author shaped the quotation. He conveniently omitted the last 9 Greek words of Psalm 40, verse 8, with their reference to doing God's will according to the Torah, shaping the end of the quotation to be more congenial to the incarnation of Jesus, who thus came to do God's will by offering himself up to death on the cross. These scattered examples tell us that we need to bear in mind that the Old Testament existed in different forms in the first century, including Greek forms that differ sometimes in trivial and sometimes in significant ways from the Hebrew text that stands at the foundation of most modern English translations of the Old Testament. They invite us into a closer examination of the recitations of texts from the Jewish scriptures in the New Testament, cautioning us not to assume that what we read from Psalms or Isaiah in Paul or in Hebrews aligns completely and easily with what we would read when we turn to those passages in Psalms or Isaiah, and that the differences may be quite significant, particularly where the Hebrew text would not be conducive to the use to which the quotation is put or the conclusion that is drawn therefrom. At the same time, we need to bear in mind that the Hebrew text on which our modern translations of the Old Testament are based is an edited and curated text, the work of specialized scribes that were an important part of the growing rabbinic movement in the generations after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. The biblical manuscripts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that Hebrew texts of the Jewish scriptures could differ from the Masoretic text, and that these texts were also in circulation prior to the rabbis' standardization of the text of the Hebrew Bible. The Masoretic text, therefore, does not always or necessarily represent the Hebrew texts that were used to translate the Old Greek version of the Old Testament, as the Septuagint version of Jeremiah demonstrates perhaps most dramatically. Perhaps the most important takeaway from these explorations is the fact that what Christians refer to as the Old Testament existed in multiple forms in the first centuries of the Common Era. Particular books circulated in different editions, quite noticeably Jeremiah, but also Job, Esther, and Daniel. All the books in the collection circulated in both Hebrew, or Aramaic, and Greek, possibly in more than one Greek translation by the end of the first century BC. In particular, the authors of the writings that would come to be collected in a New Testament drew upon the Jewish scriptures in a variety of its forms, particularly favoring the then current Greek translation or translations. We need to adopt a more elastic definition of Scripture to accommodate the realities on the ground, as it were, in that first century and in our New Testament writings. We also see many of the factors at work that inevitably introduce distance between a source text and its translation into a new language, especially a linguistically unrelated language. The source text is susceptible to being read in multiple ways, resulting in a translation that finds itself at odds with other renderings of later editions of the source text. The changed sociocultural environment of the target audience raises questions about whether or when to contemporize the text, rather than reproduce obscure references to long-forgotten realities, or to avoid more obvious or literal translations because of new resonances in the new environment, or to advance certain interpretational or ideological agendas as part of the work of translation. We also see the Jewish community dealing with the realities of translation and the inevitable distances that become apparent between a translation and its source text in ways that would reemerge around other translation projects throughout the centuries. On the one hand, some voices cite mitigating factors, introduce legendary motifs into the origin stories, or even invent theological arguments that lend greater legitimacy to the translation in the face of criticism of its inadequacies. On the other hand, others address the perceived differences by offering new editions or fresh translations that seek to approximate the source text more faithfully. In this enterprise, we also see the emergence of formal equivalent and functional equivalent approaches to translation long before anyone has created the vocabulary to talk about this spectrum, as well as the limitations of each approach as they verge toward their extremes. In the early church, beginning with the authors and communities involved in the production and the reception of the writings of the emerging New Testament, we see a translation functioning with all the authority of Scripture, even in those places where it appears to stand at some distance from that source text. Finally, it should be clear that in order to appreciate and explore the use of the Old Testament and the writings of the New Testament and the early church, we need to have ready access not only to the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, or an English translation that takes the Hebrew for its source text, but also to the Septuagint, or an English translation thereof. At the same time, we are cautioned to bear in mind that neither perfectly reflects the state of the Hebrew or the Greek text in the first century, so that we will always need to allow for some hesitancy in our observations on that basis. This video was intended merely to introduce viewers to the complex study of the Greek versions of the Old Testament, to learn more I would highly recommend these three sources. Karen Jobes and Moses Silva wrote a wonderful introduction to the study of the Septuagint, now in its second edition, and that would be my first recommendation. At the same time, Greg Lanier and William Ross wrote another fine introduction. I would say somewhat more accessible, but thereby also a less in-depth introduction, called the Septuagint, What It Is and Why It Matters. So if you are, how should we say, less fully motivated by this video, that might be a judicious next step. A masterful resource, but now we're definitely going to the advanced level, is the T&T Clark Companion to the Septuagint, which is available in paperback, so fear not the fact that it's published by T&T Clark, notorious for its expensive hardcovers, which is probably more than twice the length of the Jobes and Silva volume, but provides a very fine introduction to aspects of Septuagint study, as well as excellent introductions to each of the books of the Old Testament as they show up in the Septuagint. I would recommend either of two modern English translations of the Septuagint. In all honesty, my preference tends to be for the one edited by Albert Pietersma and Benjamin Wright, a new English translation of the Septuagint published by Oxford University Press. This was undertaken by a wide swath of dedicated Septuagint scholars. A close second is the Lexham English Septuagint, edited by Ken Penner and Rick Brannon themselves, excellent scholars and experienced translators, and to a large extent based on the work of other Septuagint and New Testament scholars that had worked on an interlinear Septuagint for Logos. These volumes will take you much further in your study of a very important textual tradition, what I like to think of as the other Old Testament, available to our New Testament authors in the first century.